You can see from my face that I'm well and I'm calm. Thanks to God, I'm fine.
On Tuesday, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro told a bunch of reporters on live TV that he's tested positive for COVID-19. But no biggie.
Everybody knew that sooner or later coronavirus would reach an important part of the population. A lot of people like me, for example.
He did wear a mask during the announcement, which is notable because he doesn't believe in wearing masks. But even as he talked about his own diagnosis, he stuck to his typical talking points.
Life goes on. Brazil has to produce. We have to get the economy going.
Under the leadership of Jair Bolsonaro, who's a right-wing populist who takes a lot of cues from Donald Trump, Brazil's coronavirus response has been a complete disaster. The country's become the second worst hit after the US, with more than 65,000 deaths and 1.6 million confirmed cases. Back in March, when the first Brazilians started dying from COVID-19, Bolsonaro said that if he got infected, he'd be able to shake it off because of his background as an athlete. And now, in the face of his positive diagnosis, his tone hasn't changed at all.
And to make things worse, the president was just inches away from these reporting crews. And at one point, he even took off his masks.
So you can see my face. Who wants to see my face?
It was true to form. We have to acknowledge that, but it was not statesman-like by any means whatsoever.
This is Gustavo Ribeiro.
I'm a Brazilian journalist and political scientist, and I am the editor-in-chief and founder of the Brazilian Report.
Gustavo, hi. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Were you surprised when you heard Bolsonaro tested positive?
Absolutely not, because from the get-go, Jair Bolsonaro denied that COVID-19 was serious. He has organized public gatherings himself on multiple occasions. He has not worn protective masks or any sort of protective gear for that matter. He has engaged in reckless behavior on a weekly basis, so it doesn't surprise us.
And he was saying that he's totally fine, right? He was kind of downplaying how serious this diagnosis was.
Oh yes, he's trying to make this diagnosis a political tool. So he wants to be himself, the poster boy for his entire rhetoric. He has used his announcement to double down on every single talking point he has used since the beginning of the pandemic, promoting hydroxychloroquine, which is the anti-malarial drug with no proven efficacy against COVID-19.
Overnight, Brazil's president posting a video of himself taking hydroxychloroquine with a thumbs up and a smile.
He has once again said that social isolation is useless because eventually most people will catch the coronavirus.
According to President Jair Bolsonaro, the virus will do more harm to people's wallets than to their health. In this video broadcast this Sunday, we see him in the middle of a crowd, encouraging small businesses and vendors to get back to work.
He has trashed governors for enacting quarantine measures and, according to Jair Bolsonaro, being the sole responsible for the economic recession we're going through.
The livelihoods of families must be safeguarded. We must return to normality. There are a few state and municipal authorities that must abandon policies like a ban on transportation, closing businesses, and mass confinement.
So he's trying to make lemonade out of the coronavirus.
And do we know how he got it?
No. But reckless behavior has been the norm in his administration. A lot of people in public service are being peer pressured to not wear masks in public buildings, especially in the presidential palace. We cannot pinpoint where exactly or when exactly the infection happened, but his administration and the public buildings in Brasilia would be breeding grounds to the coronavirus due to the fact that there is this unspoken rule that you should not wear a mask. And Bolsonaro has met with hundreds of people over the past 2 weeks. I mean, he could have caught it anywhere. Since the beginning of the pandemic, he has engaged in numerous street protests against quarantine, and it has been a badge of honor for him and his close advisors not to protect themselves from the virus.
So he's now tested positive for COVID-19, but he's also had scares in the past, right? So in March, he and his staff went on a trip to Mar-a-Lago to hang out with Donald Trump in Florida.
One of them, Bolsonaro's press secretary, tested positive for COVID-19 on Thursday and is now under quarantine at home. The entire delegation, including Bolsonaro, was subsequently tested.
And 5 of the 8 people at his dinner table, including his communications chief, got sick. He didn't get it, and he didn't seem to care at all that these people around him got sick. And like you said, he kept going to these rallies, not practicing social distancing, and basically acting like everything was normal. And it sounds like that's sort of a reflection of his stance on the virus in general.
Well, what happened after Mar-a-Lago is even worse because not only a lot of people around Bolsonaro caught the coronavirus, at one point by March 19th, 3% of all coronavirus cases in Brazil came from the presidential plane that went to Florida to meet Donald Trump. And the president, regardless of that, he took 3 coronavirus tests under aliases, and he hid the results for 2 months. It took the Supreme Court to intervene on the matter for him to make that public.
Wow.
And that's the sort of toxic environment we have in Brazil right now, where due a lot to the president's demeanor and to the way he does his politics, we have created an environment where nobody knows exactly what is true and what can be trusted. So a lot of people, when the president announced he had contracted the coronavirus, simply said they don't believe that he's infected, that maybe he's just using that as a stunt to promote hydroxychloroquine, which he has touted as a possible cure for the coronavirus on several occasions. The president has been such a disinformation agent that it's impossible to know when he's lying and when he's telling the truth.
Bolsonaro has taken this very anti-science stance on this. How has it played out in terms of policy and how Brazil has actually managed this outbreak?
I think Brazil is the perfect textbook of how not to deal with the pandemic. The government took a lot of time to take action on multiple fronts, from sanitary policies to economic policies to cope with the economic fallout caused by the coronavirus. This administration has tried to tamper with official data.
Brazil's health ministry chose to stop publishing the total tally of confirmed cases in Brazil. The president later tweeted that the cumulative data didn't reflect the moment that Brazil was living.
The president is the first one to say that catching the coronavirus is like catching some rain. It might be dangerous for a few folks, but for most people, there's nothing wrong with it. Hydroxychloroquine has been the reason for which Brazil has lost 2 health ministers during the pandemic.
Nelson Teich stepped down as Brazil's Minister of Health after just weeks in the job, as he and President Jair Bolsonaro became increasingly at odds on how to deal with the coronavirus pandemic.
Because both ministers were doctors who refused to publicly endorse this drug, which has absolutely no proven record that it works against COVID-19. But the president has always insisted that this is Brazil's official stance against the coronavirus. After pushing 2 ministers out of the cabinet, Bolsonaro named an army general with no medical background. He's an expert in logistics who accepted to write as interim minister an ordinance allowing doctors to prescribe hydroxychloroquine to any COVID-19 patients, regardless of how severe their symptoms were.
Wow. He's also been criticized for undermining local officials who've tried to impose social distancing measures and lockdowns, right?
Yes. From issuing decrees enhancing the number of so-called essential activities in order to bypass quarantine rules, to his rhetoric, which resonates with millions of people and is capable of lowering social isolation rates. Bolsonaro has done everything in his power to undermine any efforts to shut down the country and control the virus, which has put us in the worst possible scenario where the economy is not fully functioning, but the virus is still spreading around like wildfire.
I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to Wait, There's More. We'll be right back. Where has this sort of left the Brazilian people? Where is Brazil at in terms of the pandemic? What's the situation like down there right now?
Well, infection rates and deaths have gone down in major centers, but the disease is spreading to the interior of the country. Most states have started to reopen now. So many experts say that we should expect cases to spike back again. Even when we are talking about a lowering infection rate, we're still talking about 45,000 new cases per day, which is by no means a controlled outbreak. On the same day that the president announced his diagnosis, 1,200 people were killed by the coronavirus. And the thing is, the official figures do not even start to tell the tale of the spread in Brazil because we don't test nearly enough. Our data is unreliable. We don't have the same standards for data for each state. And there's no way of really saying how many people were infected and how many people died of the coronavirus. Some experts say that more than 8, maybe 9 million people have already caught the virus here in Brazil. But I guess we will never really know. What we at the Brazilian Report have analyzed is civil registry data, and we compared the number of deaths in major centers, and in places like Rio, for instance, deaths in May were 8 times higher than in 2019.
And I've heard a bit about how the virus was brought into the country by wealthy people, but is now ripping through the poorer populations. Tell me a bit about that and how socioeconomic status is playing a role in how the virus is spreading.
So the coronavirus didn't come to Brazil from Asia, but from Italy. It was brought to the country by wealthy people on business trips or on vacation in northern Italy, which was the epicenter of the outbreak at one point. And at first, it was a disease of the rich, if you will. A lot of people from wealthy families have transmitted to housemaids and to their house employees. As soon as the virus got to poorly urbanized areas, it became much more deadly because we're talking about people for whom social isolation is sometimes not an option, people who don't have access to healthcare and who cannot afford to stay home in order to isolate themselves and protect themselves and other people. We have an extremely informal economy in Brazil. We have people that are not paycheck to paycheck, but they're actually living their lives on a daily basis. So they have to make ends meet every single day. And for those people, staying home is not an option. And the thing is, once again, we do not know the true extent of the damage, because if data in Brazil can be unreliable, data in areas where the state is not that much present is even more problematic.
I've heard people place the blame for how bad the outbreak is squarely on Bolsonaro's shoulders, and people have cited Brazil's history of being able to deal really effectively with other public health crises in the past, like Zika, for example.
Michael Kenkel is an associate professor at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro.
But Brazil had every possibility of having an absolutely model response to this pandemic. We have very strong public health system. We have highly trained doctors. We have good ICU density. We have experience with pandemics. Treatment of HIV and AIDS here is actually quite advanced.
So I wonder what you think of that. Is he the one who has made things get so bad in Brazil, or are there other factors at play here that people should know about?
No, I do believe that Bolsonaro took over a country with many structural problems, but in my opinion, it's undeniable that his leadership or lack thereof has helped things get so bad so quickly. I think nobody in Brazil individually has done so much to undermine any single effort to control this pandemic. And like you said, Brazil has a history of dealing well with health crisis. We have one of the best, if not the best, AIDS program in the world. We have a program to allow people to have access to affordable drugs. We have an underfunded single-payer public healthcare system, but it is a very good one, which is arguably the biggest in the world in terms of how many people rely on it. We have a 210 million people population, and for at least 70% of them, the public healthcare system is the only option they have. And if it were not for this network that is being dismantled bit by bit, things might have been much, much worse in Brazil.
Bolsonaro is not the only world leader who's gotten COVID-19. Boris Johnson also got it, and after he spent a few days in the hospital because of it, he seemed to start taking it a little bit more seriously. I wonder if you think that that's a possibility here. Do you think this diagnosis could prompt a change of heart in Bolsonaro?
I don't think so. If we can say anything about Bolsonaro, is that he's consistent. He has always been this character. He has said and done the same things he is saying and doing for the past 28 years that he is a federally elected official. What this 1.5 years of presidency has taught us is that whenever he's cornered, his only option is doubling down on his rhetoric, on his positions. And I expect him to do that to the end.
But you mentioned at the beginning that he even used his announcement to sort of play politics. So I'm wondering how this news has been received by the people. What are people saying about his diagnosis, his supporters, his critics?
For his supporters, it is the chance to, quote, prove that the coronavirus is only a little flu. And for his detractors, we have seen on social media, for instance, a slew of posts of people hoping he dies. And even in Brazil's leading newspaper, one top columnist wrote an op-ed saying, "Why I hope Bolsonaro will die." That's the level of toxicity we're talking about here in Brazil. He has said that if Bolsonaro dies, it would serve as a cautionary tale to radicals that are denying the severity of the outbreak, and that this would spare many lives in Brazil. And he adds nothing personal, but I mean, this is the level of political debate we have seen in Brazil right now.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you about toxicity because I also heard that the country was so polarized by Bolsonaro's response to this that his opponents were out on their balconies and banging pots and pans in the evenings to vocally show their opposition. But this sounds really bad if there's people writing op-eds in the newspaper saying that they hope he dies.
Yes, no, it's pretty bad. It's been at least 5 to 10 years where we're seeing this mounting polarization. And the thing is, when we have people who simply say that the coronavirus is not real, and on the other side, we have people saying that they expect the president will die, we're talking about a scenario where there's very little middle ground and there's almost no possibility of mending fences and building bridges here, which is not good for democracy and is not good for our outlook. I mean, we are about to have an economic depression combined with a sanitary crisis. which could evolve to a humanitarian crisis, and we cannot agree on anything. So it's hard to be optimistic in Brazil. I know I'm not.
I can see why. But I wonder if you can help us understand what is Bolsonaro's play here? What's the calculation he's making as he continues to downplay the threat of this virus that now has infected over 1 million Brazilians, and he's also now contracted it? What is his goal here?
It's hard to answer your question because it follows the premise that the president is always a rational being, and that might not be the case. He has undermined his own administration's efforts to weather the crisis. I would say that he's hoping that 100% of the economic crisis is the fault of governors, and that he was an innocent bystander that got caught by the governor's ineptitude. But the thing is, and many of Bolsonaro's predecessors found out this the hard way, when things are going bad, it doesn't matter whose fault it is, it always lies on the president.
Gustavo, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
All right, that's the show. You can follow Gustavo on Twitter at GNRIBEIRO and check out his podcast, Explaining Brazil. Before we go, just a quick update. Today, the WHO formally acknowledged that droplets carrying the coronavirus may be airborne indoors, and that people who spend long periods of time in crowded settings with poor ventilation may be at risk of becoming infected. It's a reversal that many scientists say is long overdue, and it comes after more than 200 experts wrote to the agency and called on them to update their guidelines on how the virus is transmitted. We covered how the virus can spread through small droplets on the show yesterday, so if you want to know more about that, it's a pretty interesting episode, and I actually learned a lot from it. If you want to listen to it, it's called Is the Coronavirus Airborne or Not? And that's all for today. I'm Tamara Kandakar, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.